what I'd like my panel to do, I'll introduce them to you in a moment, but what I really want my panel to do today is reveal their deepest, darkest, most secret desires, the desires that you don't share with your colleagues, that you don't even perhaps share with your husbands or wives, about what you would love to see data do for higher education over that time period. Because I think we're right on the cusp of a decade where data is suddenly becoming an absolutely integral part of the way universities run, the way they're structured, the way student learning happens. And these are some of the issues that I'd like to explore today. Now, I have here today with me to do this a panel of 3 experts coming from quite different viewpoints, I think. To my right, Jon Daries is Associate Director for Institutional Research at MIT. Next to Jon is Laura Mercer, who's Chief of Staff and previously Director of Research and Analytics at Sinclair Community College in Ohio. And to the far right is Mark Milliron, who's co-founder and Chief Learning Officer of Civitas Learning, who works with an awful lot of universities in this area. And I think where I'll start, panel, if I can, is with a bit of the recent history of data in higher education and where we are in the spectrum when you compare universities and colleges and higher education institutions to perhaps more commercial organizations. Now, we all know that certain sectors like sports and healthcare have a long history of using data in very rich detail to help them sort of set strategies and set up their processes in certain ways. And I think of commercial organizations like Walmart, which famously has a sort of data approach whereby they actually devolve data experimentation down to the store level, but then draw the data that comes out of stores back into some huge data center somewhere in the Midwest, I think, and then derive decisions from that and then roll those decisions out across the entire franchise. But I wonder, when you look at those commercial organizations and indeed sectors like sport and healthcare, could you give me a view of where you think higher education is on that spectrum? Are we the sort of, I hesitate to say amateurs in the present company, because clearly there's people who are doing some great things here, but are we at the beginning of our journey here? I don't know if I kick over perhaps to Mark. Where are we, do you think, on that spectrum?
I think it's an important question, and the good news about it is sometimes it's good to be the second mouse to the cheese, right? So we can kind of learn how to use it the right way. I would say healthcare and athletics are an interesting allegory, because I think they have followed the commercial world and probably in the last decade become more mature in their use of analytics. So if you look at athletics in particular, if go back to the book Moneyball, or if there's a great local writer named Kirk Goldsberry who has a great article called Data Ball, which is all about how basketball has used analytics, and it has changed the way, changed the game of basketball to more of a three-point game and all the rest. And now you've got healthcare, especially in the last decade. I would argue the difference is in those sectors, they suddenly started getting increasingly more data. So in the healthcare sector, they started connecting electronic medical records together with the data coming from different digital tools, and suddenly they went from a trickle to a stream to a river, and that enabled them to start asking and answering bigger questions. I still remember I was Vice President for Education and Medical Practice at SAS in the mid-2000s, when those data started coming together, and there was huge controversy around electronic medical records and how people were going to use it. But when the finding came out that the number 3 killer of people in the United States turned out to be medical errors, and no one really wanted to, the medical community went through a Kubler-Rossian denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. They didn't want to kind of wrap their arms around that. But it turned out to be true, and we were spending billions of dollars on cancer research and cardiovascular research. But if we just spent a little bit of effort on fixing medical errors and actually just getting people to wash their hands, put in central lines the right way, not cut off the wrong limb, right? Good things could happen. And I would argue that began a movement in the world of healthcare where you suddenly had people having access to their charts in a way they never had before. You suddenly saw the movement towards apps and Fitbit and health indicators, where suddenly the patients and the doctors had much more real-time data to change their trajectories. That's happening in education now, and probably because we're now going from a trickle to a stream to a river, where we're now getting, we just did a white paper at Civitas called A Healthy Move in Education, where we tracked the similarities between healthcare and education in this regard. But now we're able to pull together SIS, LMS, card swipe, digital curricular resources, and we're starting to see, surprising things. That majority of our universities are losing far more students above 2.0 than below. That majority of our institutions have big chunks of students between 3.0 and 4.0 that they're losing, where it's just surprising findings. And that demography is not destiny. That student engagement is actually far more predictive than the demographic stuff. So what I think is that the education sector, like the others, are now starting to get enough of a digital stream that we can start telling the broader stories of student journeys through higher education in broader ways.
I'm going to come back to you in due course and ask what the higher education equivalent of an arm that's been accidentally chopped off is. I'm sure that the medical errors analogy will be interesting to re-explore. But if I could come to Laura and Jon, you both work in institutions, very different types of institution, but does this idea that Mark raises ring true to you, that there's suddenly a level of data, a quantity of data that just hasn't been available to you as directors of institutional research up until now?
I don't know that that's exactly true for all institutions. Sinclair is in kind of a unique position where we've actually had a data warehouse for probably 11 or 12 years now, and we have over 1 terabyte of information on our students. But the application of that and the way that you look at that data, I think, is changing now. So we're able to draw richer findings by amalgamating that data and really looking across it. And where before we were looking more at single sets of data or maybe 2 sets of data and trying to draw inferences from that, now we're looking at a much broader picture. So I think that we are fortunate in that. I don't know that all institutions are there. So, a lot of my peers that I talk to at other institutions, they don't have data warehouses. They may have a student information system or an LMS. They may or may not own that data, which is problematic as well in terms of being able to kind of put it together and see where the patterns are. I do think that along the healthcare lines, that's where I see the most promise. Understanding that a student is in trouble before they fail a class, drop out of school, is really important. And we can see that as early as 2 weeks into the term, that a student is in trouble. And that gives us time to interject to try to help save that student. So that's a different way of doing business.
Yeah, I think, just real quick, I think that analogy is and we've talked about this before, that higher education for the last 30 years in the data work has been obsessed with autopsy data. It's data about students who are not with us anymore, and it's been focused on reporting and accounting, whereas now the data is much more about during the operation or diagnostics, where we can tell ahead of time, can we save this patient now before they become a statistic? Can we actually get diagnostics so we make sure they don't ever get in trouble in the first place? That is a completely different orientation. I think higher ed is absolutely going from autopsy to operation to diagnostics, and that's been kind of exciting.
Yeah.
And related to that, the Fitbit piece of things, it's also informing the student. So students didn't know that some of the things that they were doing were actually causing them problems. So if we can start to inform them that students that are successful in this class do these kinds of things and you're really not doing these kinds of things, maybe if you try this, it gives them the chance to help intervene. Just as your doctor would tell you that your blood pressure is too high, these are some of the things that you can do to help affect it.
I think we've come onto the first area that I wanted to discuss today, which is predictive analytics. And the idea that we're moving away from a situation where we're dealing primarily with historical data, and we're moving into live data, and indeed data that's giving us a crystal ball to look into the future too. I wonder if you could maybe just give me sort of predictive analytics 101. Mark, you're probably well placed to do this. What are the sort of 2 or 3 key points that everybody needs to understand about where predictive analytics is in higher education right now, and what you're trying to achieve by implementing them?
So I think the difference is, instead of reporting on set data silos like student information systems or learning management systems, and reporting for accreditation and licensure and to your boards of trustees, predictive analytics is actually trying to pull data together from multiple data sources, and not just stage them in data warehouses, but actually take those data and do the work of creating derivative variables, which are calculating variables on top of variables, which tend to be much, much richer. So a simple example. Instead of saying a student is low income, you actually calculate what's called the affordability gap, which is the difference between the tuition they owe and the financial aid they have. That calculated variable turns out to be far more predictive. right? We have another variable called degree program alignment score, which is the calculated variable of the distance that student is from the most successful student's pathway through a given major. Those kind of derivative variables then inform models, and those predictive models can be built per institution. And I think the number one thing we've learned is in the early part of our work at Civitas, people kept pushing us to try to find one universal model for higher education. That's insanity. It doesn't work. If you haven't read the book from Todd Rose called The End of Average, it's a powerful book, and it's all about this whole notion of there's not one size fits all. Each institution is a bit of a snowflake, and you kind of need a GPS map for that institution. And so the idea of developing a predictive model that's institution-specific is incredibly important because you can understand the impact of the policies, practices, people. You can also think about the technology stack and the different students, and you understand the nuance of them getting through that institution. So I think what's happening is you're starting to see this, what I would call home analytics infrastructure emerge in higher education, where just like we had the rise of the ERP or the LMS, increasingly institutions are trying to develop an infrastructure for analytics that tells their story. They're not just borrowing data from national reports or best practice admonitions and platitudes from other places. They're actually looking at what their data say, and they're trying things and testing to see whether it's working. And most importantly, what Laura is saying is they're using design thinking to figure out how to get apps right in the hands of students, right in the hands of faculty, right in the hands of administrators, so that we can, and advisors, to figure out how we can help students in that moment make a better decision.
And is my understanding of it right that the primary purpose or one of the main ambitions of predictive analytics is to improve student success rate? We have this situation, don't we, where certain colleges, certain universities have success rates of not an awful lot over 50%. So those students who are not graduating in the time that they'd expect to graduate, obviously that's catastrophic for them personally. It's very, very expensive for them personally. The sort of debt crisis that we know all about is seriously impacted by that. Is the primary aim of the current wave of predictive analytics coming through to try and drive up that success rate? Or are there other aspects of this that fall outside of that?
I think one area where it gets more pernicious is predictive analytics around admissions and yield rates. So you have the institutions that are really concerned about having a high yield, which impacts their U.S. News ranking. And so then, you've heard about sort of how you won't offer, maybe you wouldn't offer, if you're a middle tier school, and maybe in the past you would be considered a safety school for a student, you don't admit that student because their chances of it matriculating are very low. So you determine them to be somebody that's not worth your admission slot, and you give it to somebody else who's more likely to come. So I think that's another area of predictive analytics that's really big, is what they call enrollment management.
Couldn't agree more. I think the most advanced places in higher education for the use of analytics have been admissions and alumni, right? And now we're finally starting to apply it to the journey from the minute they're admitted to the time they cross the stage, which is new, I think. And I do agree that there's an ethics that's really emerging in this work around do no harm. All right, how do you use this really for kind of three big goals? You're trying to help students learn well, finish strong, and you're really trying to help the institution optimize that learning journey for the student. So it's not just that they finish, because a lot of students are going to finish, because I think the low bar is helping quote-unquote at-risk students. We absolutely want to do that, but if we do this the right way, we can actually figure out how do you get out of the way of fast-moving students, right? How do you help somebody actually meet the right people, engage the right internship, have the best, most engaging experience? We work with institutions like Grinnell that does not have a completion problem. They're totally focused on trying to help students thrive, right? And Laura, at your place, you have incredibly high-achieving students and really struggling students, so optimizing that span is part of what your challenge is.
That's definitely true. Sinclair's an open access institution, so we have students that come in reading at almost the third grade level. So we do a lot of remedial ed, and we have students that really excel. So for us, helping students succeed, they've chosen a pathway, they have goals, that's why they're there. So it's the right thing to do to help them succeed. But this is, the kinds of stuff that we're doing right now is really an investment as well. For every 1% bump that we get in terms of course completion and program completion, it's about $425,000 a year for us. Okay, so that makes it a lot more palatable for me to invest $1 million if I can start to turn those kinds of things around. It can help me do things like increase our average class size, which allows us, again, to save considerable money in terms of the operational efficiency of the institution. So if I can get students on the right path and I can help them be successful going through the path, it's good for everybody.
Yeah. Let me ask you about, I think it was Mark, you mentioned this idea of universities as sort of special snowflakes, and it is one of the quirks of higher education, I think, that there are a lot of universities out there all doing fairly similar things, but all trying to reinvent the wheel within their institutions. It's just the nature of the sort of competitive, collaborative world that we're in. Where do you draw that line between competition and collaboration? And it strikes with me with data, at least, that more data is an unqualified good. If you're able to share data, you'll have lessons from across different types of institution. You'll have controls and all the rest of it. How much of that's going on if we're talking about trends? How much data sharing? How much are people willing to open up and say, come inside and have a look, and how much are people closing off? I mean, I know there's something called the University Innovation Alliance of 11 universities that are being quite collaborative around this area. But
well, we also, like MIT is part of two organizations that do a lot of data sharing. There's AAUDE, the AAU Data Exchange, and that's 62 research universities, including UT Austin. And it's about half private, half public, and we share a lot of stuff. I think the data that we share that's where we guard most closely is faculty salaries in order to see how competitive we are in terms of faculty salaries. And then the other one that we're part of is COFI, the Consortium on Financing Higher Education. And we actually share that's just private institutions. It's 35 highly selected private institutions. And we share record level admissions data. So we know after the admission cycle is over, the students that we offered admission to and they didn't come, where did they go? Likely they went to one of these other 34 schools. And so we're able to see, okay, who are we losing to? Who are we gaining on? Who's the bigger threat, Harvard or Stanford? And so we're doing that. But again, it's like this kind of walled garden approach where it's...
There's little doubt higher education is generally moved by reputation, regulations, and resources. Reputation's a big one, and people want to share data to get that information out. We actually called our organization Civitas Learning because it means a community learning together. And so we have a site called Civitas Learning Space where people are just sharing all kinds of information with each other. Because I'm just a firm believer, higher ed is all about the case model, right? Copy and steal everything. Someone else doing it well, I got to figure out how I pull it in myself. And what we see, though, is, and we've put out now 2 community insights reports, and our last one was a meta-analysis of 4 million student journeys in higher education. And that information is important, and it's directional, and it's insightful, but then you take that information and you figure out, let's look at that trend and see, is it happening in my place? And then once you figure that out, then you can launch some kind of an initiative and try and test to see the result. So I think what's happening is a really good set of conversations where people are starting to share and share more broadly, but they're not saying, okay, that's happening, I've got to do X. Because I think, I don't know if those of you who are involved in higher education, you probably can relate to this. We hear this all the time. Our institutions are swimming in initiative fatigue. They just have so many initiatives, and what they're trying to do is figure out what are the fewer, more impactful things they can be doing, and the only way you can get there is to kind of get away from best practicism and move towards more precision. And so what we're trying to do is enable that kind of precision. We want to get some, that analytics engine to drive towards optimization so people can get more precise about this works in our context, and that, Laura, you've been at that for a long time, right?
I would definitely say that's true. So that interaction of what works and how much to share is really critical, especially in a state that's 100% performance-based funding.
Yep.
So there's a weird blend between collaboration and competition. And we've worked a lot with especially the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're a completion by design school and we're the lead for the state. So there's a lot of sharing that goes on with that. And it's the best thing for students, and it's the best thing for the economy and the community. So we're good with that. What we try to do is be first to market. So we want to get the competitive edge early. So we invest and we run as fast as we can. And we're very thoughtful about what we do adopt. I think Mark's exactly right in terms of, it used to be you'd go out to a conference and you'd find some best practice and you'd say, oh, we got to do that. You'd bring it home and you'd try to implement it, and it may or may not be right for your institution. So being able to more thoughtfully look at data and determine not only would it work at your institution, but is that the most valuable thing for you to put your resources in? The other thing that we've done to help with the initiative fatigue is we have some goals, in terms of student success and completion. So everything that we do is not a new initiative. It's something that we use to scaffold that work. So we don't actually brand everything as a new initiative necessarily. It's all work that's being done to improve student completion. And we've looked at hundreds of things across from when they enter to when they exit.
Can I ask a question about students? I think you sort of think of data in the abstract and you have all this information that you can then play around with and develop strategies. But data points do come back to individuals very often, and students are being monitored in a way that perhaps in the past they haven't been, and that some people might feel a little bit uncomfortable about. I know there are some universities, for example, that actually monitor the location of students on campus at any given time and track, who's in the same seminar room as another student at a particular point in time, whether they're in the library for certain hours, whether they're online completing, particular online learning courses and so on. Is there any, you talked about the do no harm, is there any ethical considerations there as you start to implement these data strategies about the sort of micro-monitoring of individual students and what they're actually spending their time doing? How much thinking goes on around that?
A lot. So the New America Foundation just put out a piece here about kind of a privacy framework and some ideas to think about. But some big principles for us, one is clearly the do no harm philosophy, which is we should not be using these data to flash a red light in front of a student that says our predictive model says you're only 20% likely to graduate. It's figuring out, using design thinking to figure out what's the right way to present them data that says, oh, by the way, the next course that's your milestone, if you pass this course at this level, you're going to double your likelihood of graduating, and trying to figure out how you can use it positively. Second is this idea of the moral imperative of knowing. The truth is we're sitting on this data anyway, and most of the time what we've been doing is doing auditing and autopsy work that tells us 3 years later that this dynamic is killing us. And now we're actually getting the data in real time, and we can actually give institutions a list of students that they are likely to lose. And there is a moral imperative of knowing, right? The idea is what am I doing that I know if I'm a doctor and I get an x-ray and I see this person has cancer and I don't tell them that, it's a challenge, right? So figuring out now, what do I do because I know that? And what's the right way for me to drive some kind of intervention? But the last thing I'll say is some of this is really about the idea that students' right to know. Right? The idea is it's their data, and it's the idea that that student has the right to have their data used to help them. Because right now, their data is mostly being used to help the institution, accrediting agencies, trustees, legislators, as opposed to that data helping them make a better choice. And I would argue, I come from a first-generation family. I come from a family of 9 kids. I actually have an African-American brother, a Native American brother, a Korean sister, and we had 25 foster kids who rotated through my house during the time I was growing up. My mom was a special needs nurse. My dad was out of his mind. So, big rowdy household. But I was the first one in my family to go to higher ed. If it wasn't for Mesa Community College, I would not be sitting here today. I went through Mesa, went through Arizona State, 2 degrees, and I got a doctorate at UT Austin. But when I started, I literally didn't know what an AA stood for. I didn't know what an AS was. I kind of knew what BS was, right? Because I was totally making it up as I was going along. My kids, I have 4 kids now. I have an 18-year-old, 16-year-old, 13-year-old, and an 8-year-old, which my mom calls a starter family, by the way. Every one of my kids had a UT Austin onesie on in the crib, meaning that they have been scaffolded from birth to be ready to go on into higher ed. My daughter's about to start at UT Austin, and she has been taking college courses since the beginning of her high school year. So for us, that knowing is just different. And I would argue that second, third, fourth, fifth generation students have always been scaffolded by all kinds of insight to help them make better choices. And especially given the flood of first generation and low income students, all we're doing is evening the playing field. We're allowing brand new students who have no scaffold to stand on the shoulders of lots of successful students and say, oh, by the way, a student like you is at this stage, here's the next set of courses you probably should take. And the idea that we're kind of equaling what I would call, we're equaling the aristocracy effect, right? Where if you're not coming from that kind of a background, you get that kind of a scaffold. So I do think that comes into play, and I fully understand the ethical implications of this, and we've got to be careful about privacy. But I think part of this, I've flipped that on its head and said that student has the right to have their data help them.
Jon, if I could come to you, obviously MIT has been one of the institutions that's really led on MOOCs and the MITx initiative. Huge amounts of data must flood into you from the hundreds of thousands of students that take MOOCs. How useful have you found it, or how perhaps a better way of posing the question is, how difficult have you found it to to actually draw useful conclusions from that data, to sift out the noise from the stuff that you can actually do something with.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we first launched it, the idea was that this would be this amazing storehouse of data, and we'd solve education with all this data. And yeah, it's really funny that, so we have a sort of a promise that any researcher who wants to use the data for research and comes to us, we'll provide them with the data. And there's a real funny sort of evolution that I've come to watch in their excitement about the project. When they first meet with us, they have these grand ambitions. And then after they get their first data dump from us, they sort of write back with some questions like, well, what exactly is all this? And I'm like, well, there's a row for every time they clicked. And so, you know, do with that what you will. Yeah, it's been really difficult. I think we were hoping to be able to figure out, okay, if you do this in a course, then this is what means that you're successful. And we found that it's not easy to define what it means to be successful in a MOOC. I think probably similar to the community college, where people come to with very many goals. Some people just want to take one course, some people want a degree. Same with the MOOC. Some people just want to freshen up on one topic from calculus they forgot from 20 years ago. And some people think this is how they're going to, you know, build the scaffolding, as we've been talking about, for their own higher education, maybe a degree at some point in the future. And so success is hard to define. Engagement is really hard to define. You can start one of the videos and then walk away and make yourself a Hot Pocket, and we'll never know that you didn't watch that video. And you know, it's sort of just until I don't know that we're ever going to convince them to get some kind of proprietary software, because the whole point of it is for it to be open. So we're always going to be sort of hamstrung by whatever web browsers can give to us. So I think that there have been some interesting insights. One of the papers I can think of is to do with cheating and being able to identify cheaters. So it's not exactly solving education, but I think that what has been interesting is we went from having 12-week courses that identically replicated what we teach on campus to more and more modularized, so it's just more and more focused, and the experiments are tinier and tinier and more focused. So maybe instead of having grand ambitions, really having small ambitions.
And have you, I wonder if I could just, while we're on the question of MOOCs, the whole point, well, the great ambition for MOOCs was that this would be democratizing education on a global scale, and you'd be reaching out to the kid in an Indian slum that wouldn't have had any other opportunity for accessing higher education. And I know that the narrative since then has been very much that didn't happen, that it was, you know, people with degrees under their belts already that were coming back for a bit of personal interest or career development or whatever else it might be. Is there anything that you found in terms of sifting through the data that sheds any light on how those different groups have interacted with MOOCs, or anything that we might draw from the data there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely, we've seen where, way more, it's not nearly as, children in the slums as you would think. It's mostly like people with bachelor's degrees, or so they say, right? It's all self-reported. They self-report their birth year, and some people put in there they were born in 1897, and I doubt that that's true. It just happens to be the earliest value that's available. But it's interesting because we've learned a lot about how we sort of had assumptions that people would be learners one-on-one, and then we find in countries where they have really poor internet access that they'll just download all the videos. One person will, and they'll all sit around a screen together and watch the videos. So that means that our engagement metrics for those people are going to be way out of whack. I mean, I think it's just really hard for us to know exactly who's engaging with it how across cultures. You know, I think that one thing that sort of sprung up were these Facebook groups that were interacting largely outside of the platform. So I think that since if we're successful with a MOOC, it's going to be integrated into some larger cyber ecosystem that we're not going to really be able to measure. So yeah, I think as far as access, it's out there, but there's still a big barrier between having access to a computer and then maybe taking an MIT course.
Yeah. Let me take the conversation on, if I can, to academics. Academics hate being measured, don't they? I mean, they absolutely loathe it. The idea that they can be reduced to a number is shocking and outrageous, and how dare we? And in some ways, I think that's been seen as special pleading outside of higher education. The idea that, you know, academia is the one public good, if you like. I won't call it public sector because clearly it isn't, but it's a public good that shouldn't be measured and shouldn't be asked to show a return on investment for students and return on investment for government funders in terms of research output, research impact, all those sorts of things. But I think where they have a fair point is that it's a bit like, I'm a journalist, so journalists hate being measured on clicks to stories, because if you measure us on clicks, we're just going to write lots of stories about cute kittens and things like that. And that's what gets the clicks. it's a question of measuring the right things. And I'm just wondering if I could throw this out to the panel. Are there any baskets of metrics for measuring academic performance that you think are appropriate, do drive improvements in academic performance, and within the context of your institution, certainly Laura and John, perhaps would get buy-in from academics in a way that, that perhaps some of the attempts to measure academic performance with data thus far haven't?
I mean, I think the approach that we've taken that's been really successful and sort of ties to something that you were saying earlier about transparency, is that we've launched sort of a record of all the data that we have about our faculty, and they can log in and edit it and amend it and augment it to their liking. And so I think that's helped a lot, is that they see where the data are coming from. So we say, okay, from our data warehouse, we know about your grants, we know about your patents, we know about publications that we buy from this vendor for publications and citations. And so here it all is, you can edit it, and then when annual review comes around, then your faculty members can look at it. And so I think we just try to take both the transparent and holistic, just have something, anything they come up with, and they come and meet with us and say, well, you're not capturing juried architecture competitions, which the architects, they're a small faction of our faculty, but they're measured very differently than, say, a physicist would be. So every time they come to us, we modify the platform, put room for them to be able to represent themselves, and I think by making it holistic and capturing as much as possible and letting them see it, that's been really successful for us.
I don't know if you have any reflections, particularly perhaps around the area of human judgment moderating the data in that way. Is that the key here?
Definitely. I think that like at Sinclair, we have like all of the courses, there's a student reflection on the course of the teacher. So they're self-assessed, but most of that data stays with the faculty member. It doesn't even go any further, so it should be used for self-improvement there. And then we fairly publicly have looked at a long time at course success rate. But you have to look at that in the context of like the average class size for those courses as well. I mean, if you have, a really small class and a couple of students fail, it make your rate look horrendous compared to, a larger class. So I think you have to look at it in the context. In terms of not using data as being punitive, but to open a conversation about how we might do better. I think, the vast majority of faculty at any institution really care about the students and student success. So if you can approach it constructively rather than punitively, I think it opens the conversation there.
I mean, I think that's the paradox. I mean, the paradox is our accountability obsession actually hurts us taking advantage of the value of what I would call aggregated marginal gains. Small moves at the front lines if we can get better data to the front lines. Because we're so focused on using data for accountability that we've made the immune system of higher ed resistant to using data sometimes. And what we see, for example, is if you can use design thinking to figure out what's the way in which you could bring the data to faculty that they'll want to use it. So I would argue great faculty members have been using data, always have been data voracious. They want formative assessment, summative assessment, eye contact, body language, writing, projects, whatever it is. These are just new data. And if you, instead of saying that they're going to fix the world, but say, here's a new data stream and let's process this signal together and figure it out, and let's bring it to you in new ways, give them heat maps of engagement, give them different kinds of things they can interact with. It's very similar to what happens with Fitbits, where people kind of make fun of Fitbits until they get one, and then they start looking at the data, and suddenly they get very interested in their heart rate, and they're interested in their exercise regimen and the rest, and suddenly that becomes part of how they're managing their health. And that's what we're seeing with faculty, is that faculty get this data, and what they find out is, we've had a group of faculty members who've been using these kinds of data, and what they found out is micro mindset messages have the biggest impact. Just little empathetic messages that tell students in the beginning, yeah, I know this subject's hard, it's your first time taking this kind of a subject. If you need any help, make sure you reach out to me. I know these are the dog days of the semester. Do not hesitate to ask for it. Finishing strong really matters. Make sure you kind of get ready for the final right now. Those little mindset messages have more impact than any of the kind of like elite academic things they might be thinking of. But the fact that they tried and tested that is beautiful. To me, that's student success science at its best. I don't think we're going to be able to take advantage of that if our mindset is so obsessed with accountability. Because what happens is you suddenly get faculty and advisors and everyone else shutting down because they think you only want to use this to hammer them as opposed to use it to help them improve. That's your improvement idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me, one of the trends that's happened over the last 10 years has been sort of third-party data giving an overview of university performance. So I'm thinking of rankings here. There are, Times Higher Education publishes a ranking. There are other respectable alternatives out there too, of course. And it's something that's proliferated over 10, 12 years, and where it's probably a decade ago was seen as a fairly marginal part of the sector, it's now front and center in the way that universities are run. So we have governing bodies that are actually setting strategies according to, targets within particular rankings. There are, any number of governments that are out there that are actually deciding funding priorities on the basis of rankings, and so on and so forth. In terms of third-party data, I suppose there's also initiatives like the College Scorecard from the US government. And in the UK, it was just an interesting sort of alternative take on things. There are two very large data frameworks that have been introduced to measure research, called the Research Excellence Framework, and it hasn't come out yet, but it's been hugely controversial in the UK, the Teaching Excellence Framework. I just wonder if I can focus on the latter here, teaching, because I think it's become fairly accepted that research can be measured appropriately and objectively. And certainly most of the rankings are heavily focused on research output. Teaching is much harder to do, and I think that's partly because we have to come up with some way of measuring the value add or the learning gain that universities introduce, some sort of benchmark system for measuring teaching quality. Now, what they're doing in the UK in the Teaching Excellence Framework is they're going to be measuring three proxies for teaching excellence. One is graduate salaries, and that's going to be measured just 6 months after graduation, so very, very early on in a graduate's professional life. Another is completion rates or dropout rates, and a third is student satisfaction. Now, the debate in the UK has been very much around saying, well, these aren't actually proxies for teaching excellence at all. They're measuring what they're measuring, but none of those things are teaching excellence. Put them together as a basket of metrics and benchmark it, and the government argues you come up with something that's useful. But I wonder if I could just throw this idea to the three of you as, is there a way, what's your sort of reflection on that attempt being made by the UK government to put a framework over what good teaching looks like at a sector-wide level? Does that strike you as a good idea or mad?
There you go.
Yeah, I would say it's mad. I think it's one project I heard about was this researcher, Tom Kane. He did something called Measures of Effective Teaching, where he put cameras in classrooms, in K-12 classrooms, and watched them for like 9 months, and then looked at the value-added measures on the scores to try to figure out, okay, physically, what are the teachers that have higher gains? What are they doing? And getting research assistants to code every different teaching practice. And I think even that, after he completed the project, he sort of admitted that they didn't really find what they were looking for. So if that doesn't work, then I don't see how looking at something across the sector is going to really, I think it depends on what the class is, what the subject material is, who the students are. For those who listened to the keynote this morning, it's about as much as teaching the students who show up as it is teaching the material that you have prepared. So yeah, I don't see how that would actually measure teaching.
Interesting side note about that Tom Kane study is one of the things they found out is the teachers didn't want the cameras out. In the beginning, the teachers did not want the cameras in their classroom, but by the end of the study, they didn't want the cameras out. Because what happened was when the kid did something wrong and the teacher notified the parent the kid had did something wrong, the parents would argue their beautiful, wonderful, talented child would never do that, and they would come in and say,
go to the tape.
Let's look at the tape. It changed the dialogue, right? So there are unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And I think, going to that's the essence of it, is when you set out those kind of accountability metrics, you end up with unintended consequences, where you're now going to have universities focusing on doing things to specifically create higher satisfaction rates, high impact jobs when they first get out. And just a good example is here in Texas, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board can show you data that there's a kind of a liberal arts lag, where students coming out of liberal arts programs might not get a great starting salary when they first start, but within 10 years, they actually equal and begin to surpass those students. So what you do is you end up, if that kind of a framework would come in, you'd have a bunch of students probably leaving liberal arts programs and heavier focus on those programs that have high, first job salaries. And again, that's where you just have to figure out how you tune and test those metrics. Ohio is a good example because Ohio has put this performance-based funding model in place, and people are jumping to try to respond to the performance-based funding. But again, it can cause some unintended consequences, like higher education being less likely to be interested in serving harder to serve students, first-generation students, diverse students. And that's where you just have to be really careful, because you could end up hurting yourselves. What's clear in the US, at least, is that for us to meet higher education goals, we have to serve more and more diverse students than ever before. And if we get simplistic with some of these measures, we can absolutely kill ourselves in reaching those kind of goals.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a crucial point with, we publish a US college ranking with the Wall Street Journal, and one of the things we've done there is introduce a diversity measure where we do benchmark based on the basic understanding that a diverse classroom is a good thing. But there's even unintended consequences there, because you suddenly find that with the historically black colleges, for example, they don't have very diverse, if diversity is measured as you pull 2 students out at random and they have a different background, well, you go to somewhere like Howard and that, at face value, has a very undiverse classroom. But that's not a bad thing in terms of how we were trying to measure it. So even within that ranking, we had to come up with some ways of dealing with those sort of different types of institution that exist within a system. Yeah. I think the issue of value add, just to draw one other example, similar to the point you were making, Mark, about unintended consequences. One of the things that they're talking about doing again in the UK, I'm based in London, so excuse the local example from London, but one of the things that the government's trying to do is draw very granular data on the graduate premium, the additional money that you earn from studying a particular course, right down to the granular course level. And the real worry there is that if you actually expose that data 10 years out and discover that if you study philosophy, for example, you have no graduate premium whatsoever, versus economics, where you're going to be earning, 1.5 million extra over your lifetime, or whatever the figure might be, you'll essentially kill off philosophy at one fell stroke. Now, that's clearly not the government's intention, but the question to you as the experts that deal with this data day in, day out, how do you deal with uncomfortable data, or data that perhaps doesn't give you the answer you're looking for, or perhaps raises a red flag to you saying this could have an unintended consequence? Should we just be sweeping that data under the carpet, or not exposing it to the light of day at all? Or what's the way that you deal with data that you instinctively have a worry about when you see it?
I think you have to subject it to thoughtful conversation. I mean, none of this data, even if you look at just on the student level, like engagement versus their performance and grade, it's not that simple. I mean, you can't look at just one indicator and figure out what's going on with that student. You have to look at kind of a matrix of stuff and have a discussion with it. So I think that even uncomfortable data is worth uncovering and discussing. You may not want to splash it on the front page of the newspaper because people won't understand it. But if you have thoughtful, engaged faculty and administrators that can kind of discuss it and figure out what it really means and what the implications might be, I think that's worth doing.
I mean, the danger is, unfortunately, in many higher education institutions, there's almost a culture of blame. Right? If bad data comes up, it's whose fault is that, right? And I think the institutions that are making progress are the ones that are moving towards a culture of wonder, where they're actually using in some ways, the rhetoric of the academy to work with the academy, right? So let's get critically thinking about this. Let's get creative about whatever this is and figure out how we can drive a solution. So we had an institution recently, they talked about this last week at a conference, Achieving the Dream, where they looked at trying to look at every single one of their majors, and they're trying to give recommendations to the students about which electives they should choose in these different majors. And when they did the analysis course by course and the courses product that we have, their jaw dropped, because the top electives being chosen, especially by first-generation students, turned out to be things like advertising, aquatic science, anatomy and physiology, and they went, oh my gosh, they're picking these alphabetically. Yeah. I mean, they literally, when it came to elective, they would just go and pick the first one. And the realization that a lot of these first-generation students have nobody there scaffolding them about what they should take, and they're just taking what's out there. That's uncomfortable. Yeah. And they've been doing that for a decade, right? Putting that kind of drop down in front of those students. That's when you go, okay, that's a sucker punch. You got to take a deep breath on that and say, okay, we got to change that. right? And those are the kind of things where I think the more we uncover, and we start looking at these student journeys, we're going to learn that, yes, there are some challenges for some students academically, but what we're finding is that a lot of the challenges are life and logistics, and a lot of the challenges are psychosocial, and a lot of the things we have to fix is very much like healthcare. They had to deal with medical errors. There's probably the same thing in our world, which is programs that don't make sense, literally degree maps where you're actually having people take a prerequisite and the following course in the same semester, transfer agreements that don't match up and they lose credits. There's all kinds of things that we got to fix, and that's going to be uncomfortable, but we have to have the courage to have those conversations.
I meant to ask you about your medical errors, so thanks for coming back on that. We have 10 or 15 minutes left, and I do, right at the end, I'm going to ask each of you to give me your biggest, boldest prediction for what you think how you think data will fundamentally change how universities exist, really, in the next 5 to 10 years. So we'll do that right at the end. But before that, would anybody like to ask questions from the floor? I think we have a couple of microphones. There's a lady here in the middle. Perhaps if you just tell us who you are and where you're from, and then ask your question and direct it to somebody if you want to. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Kimmy Pentillo, and I'm from New York. And thank you for moderating this panel. It's been, quite interesting. And so I have two questions. One is for Jon Daries, and that is, how do the completion rates for Coursera and edX affect your data analytics? Because I hear for the free courses, they're rather low. And then for Mark, you sound like you do a fantastic job with your children in prepping them for school. And I was wondering what percentage of data that emphasizes reinforcement and accountability can substitute for parenting skills?
Yeah, so I think for the completion rates around the MOOCs, when we first started, we had the denominator be anybody who signed up for the course. And then we quickly realized that we're going to get some really, really low numbers out of that, like, less than 5% in some courses, but never more than 10. And so we just started carving away at that denominator. So, we figured out that a lot of people I've done this many times myself, they sign up for one of the courses. Oh, that sounds cool, and they sign up, but they never, ever do anything else. So those people we just take away because they've never even looked at the course material. Then we have a much smaller denominator, and then we start to see here's a group of people that actually engaged with it. Then you can look at people who actually engage with more than 50% of the chapters. And then edX made a change, I guess it was made 2 years ago, where you couldn't get a certificate anymore unless you paid. And so then you can start looking at just the universe of people who put some money in the game. And that sort of undoes the whole idea of the free open courses, but it becomes a more interesting analytical group. Because here are people that were at least willing to put forward $40 or whatever, that they cared enough to do that, so they tend to be a better group to look at completion rates within there. So I'd say basically whittling away the denominator is how we've dealt with that.
So every year I'm blessed to be asked to give commencement addresses, and there's nothing I love more than going to graduation ceremonies. And the essence of my talks always is around this idea of what I call each one reach one, which is the idea that anybody who's graduating today in American higher education, I feel it is they should accept the responsibility of at least reaching out to one other person and helping them on an education journey in some way, because what the data show is that while we might not be able to replace parents for all the kids that are out there, is that just getting one adult in somebody else's life, friend, family member, community member who cares about them completing and that can help guide them on that it creates a momentum point for that person. And so I actually think it is one of those things where we have to just encourage as many graduates as possible that each one, reach back, because it really is about creating those kind of connections. And one of the fun thing about this work is I'm actually seeing the possibilities of using almost Match.com technology to be able to create near-peer relationships where it's really about helping those people develop those kind of connections and getting people a sense of responsibility for doing that kind of reach.
Great. We probably have time for another question if anybody has one.
One in the back. We're way in the back.
Way in the back.
Sorry, I'm staring into the lights. You're right at the back. Thank you. The big room.
Thank you. I listened with great interest about your discussion about being a doctor practicing preventative medicine. I consider myself sort of a loan doctor that is working to feverishly deflate the student loan bubble before it pops. And like you, I would like to do as much preventative medicine as work as possible. I'm curious, though, when you talked about uncovering the data, even if it's uncomfortable, how do you approach that when schools might say accept students that may not be capable of doing work, but they need to enroll a certain amount to make their number and enroll their class? Like, how do you address these issues as far as data about loans with like parent loans? We don't know the full picture of that, and a lot of times, absence of evidence isn't necessarily means that there's not a problem, but that we just can't quantify it or it's not statistically significant. So we know anecdotally things are a problem, but it's very difficult to prove them to make them statistically significant. I'm curious, how do you approach that? How do you bridge the gaps, I would guess, in sort of the data?
I'm sure none of your universities would operate in such a way, but I mean, this issue of exploitative colleges that do enroll students that are destined to fail, and obviously the student debt mountain that's going there. Does data have any lessons for us? Any way we can use data to sort of limit this problem as it exists today?
Well, I'd say there are two approaches, because as a community college, if you've got a GED or a high school diploma, you can come to us. Or if you're a pre-college student, you can come to us. So we don't have the kinds of barriers that a selective institution would have. And as a result, we get students that are not ready for a lot of college-level work. So we've spent a lot of time and effort, thanks to folks like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in figuring out alternative ways to ensure that students get what they need in a manner that works for them to bring them up to college level. So, with math, we've got boot camps now, we've got modularized curriculum, and we've got a bunch of different pathways, and we've really been able to collapse some stuff as well, and we're experimenting with things where instead of testing a student when you go in for placement testing, you start with the easiest stuff first, and then work them up until they start to fail, and that's where you place them. We do it opposite, because the stuff that was easiest a lot of the times is the stuff that they've forgotten. They may not know how to do fractions, but they can do, higher level algebra or even calculus, because they've had that more recently. So we kind of back them down. So we try everything we can to get them up to speed. I do think that the data is showing us stuff differently, though, and it's concerning, but it was happening anyway, and now we know about it. So to Mark's point, we have an obligation to do something about it, because I will see students that are on academic probation. Okay, so they're a step away from being dismissed. So first term is academic intervention, then it's probation, then it's dismissal. So they'll be on their second term of poor performance, and 2 weeks into the term, I can tell they're not doing what they need to do. So that's our chance, preferably when they first start with us rather than when they're about to go out, to intervene, to try to stop that pattern before they incur more debt, more bad grades that are going to provide barriers to them when they finally get their act together and they want to go forward. So it gives us a chance to intervene.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, we only have 5 minutes left, so it's prediction time. I want one big, bold prediction for what's next. Say 5 years out, what is the one thing that's going to be fundamentally different in the way universities go about their business in 5 years' time, 10 years if you like, driven by data? Mark?
So I think we are entering the golden age of learning. And I'm not being hyperbolic about that. I think the lights are being turned on in a way where the kind of good intentioned student success scientists among us are going to be asking and answering questions about what works and what doesn't for student pathways in a way we haven't ever before. In addition, I think there is more of a push to get data in the hands of students, in the hands of faculty, in the hands of, I think most faculty, by the way, in higher education are the equivalent of battlefield surgeons. They're highly trained professionals in low information environments who never see the results of their work. And now we're going to actually connect those dots where they suddenly can get data in a way they've never had it before. And I think that is a game changer. And it's a game changer for how educational institutions operate and optimize those learning pathways. We can now ask and answer all kinds of questions we couldn't ask and answer before. And we're going to see innovation happen in a way where we're going to see innovation to impact. That innovation to impact distance is going to get shorter and shorter and shorter, and people are going to get faster and faster. It'll get better and better and better, quicker and quicker and quicker. But most importantly, I think within 5 to 10 years, the time of students trying to navigate this crazy Byzantine bureaucracy of higher education is the time where they actually have to kind of wade through this in the dark is going to be gone. The lights are going to be on in a way where basically they're going to have at their fingertips a student like you at this stage. Here's the next set of courses you probably should take. And I think we're going to be able to close that kind of what I would call aristocracy gap where our first generation students can be more successful than ever before. And that all comes about if we're willing to make this move kind of from accountability analytics to kind of broader operational diagnostic and what I would say optimization analytics. But it means we got to do this together. It's not going to be one tool, one technique. It's going to be a community that's willing to look at the hard data and innovate and especially being willing to democratize the data and get it in the hands of folks on the front lines.
Thank you. Laura.
So I think as earlier perhaps than 5 years from now even, we're going to see students come into our fold, and instead of handling them as part of the cattle call of students that are coming in, we're going to look at them as individuals, and we're going to have enough sense of signal on them from the day they walk into our institutions throughout their journey to be able to give them what they need when they need it. And that's going to make our institutions more efficient, and that's going to make those students more successful. So it's just-in-time interventions throughout the student's journey.
And inspirations.
And inspiration.
Yeah.
Thank you. And John, your prediction?
Yeah, I think that one thing we're seeing changing already is more of an appetite for experiments in education. You know, for a long time, there's been no desire to do true random control trials in education. And I think now we finally have enough data where it's people are, and just sort of experimentation is so much more part of our data-driven culture that people are going to be willing to do true experiments instead of just, so much of what we talked about today is just association. Right. We don't really have a lot of evidence about what really causes any of these changes or what's inside the black box. But I think, if I may offer one pessimistic prediction, I think that someone will figure out how to monetize educational data, and we'll see students signing away their data privacy in exchange for scholarship.
Well, there you go. It's fascinating, and I think I asked for big, bold predictions, and I think the biggest and boldest in a way was Mark's prediction that we'd see an end to Byzantine bureaucracy in higher education. Imagine that. That really would be revolutionary. Well, thanks so much to my panel. Thanks to all of you for being here. But that's it for this session. Thank you.